Chosen Chapters from the Velvet Paw of Asquith novels, also known as the Dooven Books, by Thomas Corfield. Read by the author. Chapter 3 from With Eyes No Longer Blind, Chapter 16, in which Oscar is introduced to the extraordinary legal system of Bisarah, which has his temper become even shorter than his ears and his confusion boundless. The auditorium cascaded down toward a stage. Its ceiling was high and domed, and appeared to be supported by the vast columns of sunlight streaming from it. The air smelt of dust, age and wisdom, and reverberated with the mutterings of an audience in flux. Huge waterfalls of bunched curtains hung at its perimeter, tied with the sort of ropes often used to tether planets. Animals shifted along rows of seating in a manner suggesting the place was an enormous theatre rather than legally binding. Oscar had expected an air of tension, but instead there was an atmosphere of conviviality that made his brewing cynicism feel even more out of place than he did. Flumped pulled him aside, while those who'd been waiting with them squeezed past. "These doors," he said, "like those on the far side, are open periodically to allow the audience to come and go without disturbing the cases already underway." He pointed to a small assortment of animals upon the stage. "Those animals down there are the plaintiffs, and that animal on the other side is the accused." "What do they accuse each other of?" Oscar asked, his cynicism ripe. "Too many hugs?" "Yes, sometimes." When Oscar stared at him, Flumped ushered him to an aisle, which they shuffled along between wooden benches curving around the auditorium in lessening levels of orbit. At the lower levels, which were already occupied, they found space beside Frengal Plint and sat. "And you're absolutely certain I'm not going to be forced to perform?" said Oscar, uncomfortable with the auditorium's distinct theatrical overtones. Flumped offered a reassuring smile. The stage was a fluster of animals sorting themselves into sides. On a raised platform behind the stage's rear were 4 large regal chairs, upon which sat 3 animals who were clearly in charge. One was an elderly dog draped in dark green robes laced with white, who wore a modest crown and held a long, shiny stick with something expensive on one end. Beside him resided another. She was dressed in a similar manner and watched the fuss upon the stage with a patient smile. Beside both sat an elderly cat, who wasn't nearly so well adorned, but waited with similar serenity. The 4th chair remained vacant. "The plaintiffs state their case through a narrator," Flumped was saying, "to those upon the thrones, before the accused offers their side of the story." "And presumably those animals are judges," Oscar said, wishing they could dispense with proceedings and meet whoever Flumped wanted him to, before further confusion had him forget the reason why. Beside him, Frengal Plint looked puzzled. "Judges?" he asked. "What are judges?" "The animal with the crown tied in place by his ears is the boundless," Flumped continued, ignoring him, "the king of Bisarah, and—" "Excuse me," said Oscar, "but tied in place by his what?" "Well, his ears." "His ears?" "Yes." Oscar glanced between them before asking, "Why is his crown tied in place with his ears?" "Well, to stop it falling off," Frengal Plint said. "But that's ridiculous." Flump frowned. "Surely it would be more ridiculous if he used somebody else's." With a sigh bordering on clinical withering, Oscar surrendered. "And the animal beside him," Flump continued, "is a boundless, his queen." "Boundless," tried Oscar. "No," said Flumped, "the boundless." "Boundless." "No, don't overemphasize the syllables. Boundless. Boundless. That's too many syllables," said Flumped. "It should only have 5. Boundless. Boundless. Why are you using so many syllables?" "I don't know," said Oscar, folding his paws indignantly. "Once I start, I'm unable to stop." "And the cat beside them?" "That," said Flumped, "is Miranelk, the animal I wish you to meet." Oscar peered at her. She dozed between slow blinks and appeared even less capable of offering explanation than Flumped, which left him convinced that any creature attempting explanation about anything in this place would begin by scrubbing themselves with potatoes before trying to breathe sand. He closed his eyes and tried not to swear. This was like a very bad dream, one of those horrid ones where hope teases, turns nasty, and leaves absurdity to commandeer everything. For a moment, he understood Laia's outburst. Before he could hit anything, however, Flumt advised the session was about to begin. Lights dimmed, and silence fell. An animal rose to address the three upon thrones. "My dear Boavisus and Miranelk, I present to you our case entitled, 'We honestly didn't realize she was allergic to goats.'" There was a nod from the three. The animal continued, "Once upon a time, there were 3 burglars." The 3 plaintiffs stood and began prancing around the stage very badly. The narrator continued, "They were quite nice and had burgled successfully for many years, which resulted in countless numbers of hapless yet satisfied victims." The prancing was so bad that 2 ran into each other, after which they continued their careering by adding pirouettes in a manner suggesting they'd never attempted anything of the sort before. Oscar turned to Flumt in the hope that the dog was as keen as he to leave, but Flumt watched engrossed. When Oscar glanced at famed Plint, the dog appeared even more absorbed than Flumt, which left Oscar wondering if blazing idiocy was infectious. Trapped between them, he felt claustrophobic and had a need to eat his paws. He wanted to find Laia and encourage her to start punching things, including him, but was instead forced to endure the bizarre performance with an uneasiness bordering on agony. The narrator said, "One day last week they came across the accused." He pointed at the animal sitting upon the stage's other side, who waved, "and decided to burgle her, which they did quite well by all accounts, for they forced her to accept 3 goats and a chicken." A reenactment of said transaction was mimed, which apparently involved disemboweling each other with gardening rakes. When Oscar glanced at his companions again, they remained riveted. "Though it turned out," the narrator continued, "that the accused is allergic to chickens, which is unfortunate given the act of the plaintiffs." At that moment, something struck Oscar. Not a brick or anything, as that would have been dreadful, more the peculiarity that the burglars were accusing the victim. When he pointed this out to Flumt, the dog smiled and said, "That is why I like this place so much, Oscar. Just wait and see." The narrator continued, "But sadly, not only is the accused allergic to chicken, she is also allergic to goats." There was a gasp from an astonished audience, of which Oscar was convinced he was no longer a member. "And although this is not an oversight on the burglar's part," the narrator went on, "they were then dismayed still further when realizing the goats were also allergic to chickens, which meant the whole thing got rather messy, as you might imagine." There were murmurs from the audience that they did indeed, and the 3 upon thrones nodded, which left Oscar almost envious. "So, in closing," the narrator said, "they would like to give her a big hug by way of apology and offer her a selection of other hypoallergenic offerings as compensation, including, but not limited to, a table, some lovely patterned curtains, a collection of small watercolour prints, and a used garden water feature which is slightly cracked. None of these items lays eggs, I'm led to understand, though I believe that one of the prints is of a chicken." In despair, Oscar slapped his face, which had Frengle Plint asking whether he was worried the accused might be allergic to prints as well. Ignoring him, Oscar turned to Flumt. "I know it's a lot to ask," he said, "but would you kill me, please? I'd feel much better about everything if you just killed me now." With a smile, Flumt said, "I know all this seems a bit peculiar, Oscar, but I can assure you it's quite wonderful. Under the circumstances, Flumt, you couldn't assure me that my bum isn't some sort of spongy on button. Patience, Oscar. After this, we shall seek answers from Miranelk. She knows all there is to know, which is why she sits beside the Bovis." I'm sorry," said Oscar, "but that fills me with little confidence. Madness is madness, regardless of how mad everything is." Flumt smiled again. "It is our world that is mad, Oscar, not this one." Oscar looked at the old cat upon throne. "Are you seriously suggesting that animal can tell me what's been going on?" "Yes." "But she's half asleep." Flumt shrugged. "Perhaps it's only when we're asleep that we're ever awake." Oscar turned to him with a stare that bordered on assault. "What the You're mad too," he said. "You've just taken 2 fundamentally opposite statements and equated them to each other. You couldn't get more contradictory if you'd offered that statement as a working example." "Nevertheless, Miranelk knows all there is to know on the matter." "You mean on contradiction? I don't doubt it." Calm yourself, Oscar. She can explain how you came to be here. Is that right? Yes. And what has you so certain, Flumped? Because Miranelk is from our world too. Oscar's irritation evaporated, leaving a faint glimmer of hope behind that was young, had good career prospects, and probably keen on renovating. Before Oscar could say anything further, Flumped indicated the stage again and explained it was the accused's turn. She stood, while the cavorting burglars sat. The narrator continued, "On the other paw, the accused apologizes for the concern that her congenital aberration has caused and wishes to invite them all over for a curry, perhaps on Thursday." The accused did not dance, but stood while the burglars deliberated over the suggestion. When one approached the narrator and said something, the narrator nodded and addressed the thrones. "The burglars thank her for the invitation, but do not wish the accused to go to any trouble, being concerned that after all they've put her through, she'd think they were taking advantage of her hospitality." There were some nods from the thrones. "They'd also like to mention that her scabs look much better and not nearly so puffy." The accused approached the narrator again, and there was some deliberation before the narrator addressed his audience. "The accused insists that she's been intending to have her family around for dinner for some time, but hasn't managed, what with work and everything. Moreover, her brother has just got engaged, so she has to make an effort. She insists, therefore, that the invitation remains." The accused whispered something else. "She further suggests Thursday might be a bit early, however, as her scabs have started to peel and could end up in the curry." There was some more deliberation on the part of the burglars, which was conveyed through the narrator in suggesting they have it at their place instead, so the accuser didn't have to worry about her scabs, and would she like to pop over to their place with a salad at about 6:30 on Saturday. Her family was welcome too. There was plenty of room apparently, particularly if she accepted the table and water feature first. This was mulled over by the accused, who advised she felt as concerned for the burglars' inconvenience as they'd been with hers. This was countered with assurances to the contrary, and that they really liked curries. And if Saturday was no good, why don't her family perhaps drop by randomly one day next week? Or even stay with them for a while? Or better still, they all move in together and really make a go of it. In the end, the four decided to go on holiday somewhere south next spring. Some spoons were exchanged and scabs admired, all of which was followed by music from a small jazz band that appeared in a corner, interspersed with lots of hugging involving the narrator, the king and queen, and even the musicians. All this was accompanied with an enthusiastic round of applause from the audience, which threw flowers. Several members hurried on stage to share in the embrace, which, according to Fane Plint, was traditional. It looked less like a trial and more like a wedding, and Oscar was left staring at the plaintiffs, the accused, and those on the thrones as though they were all madder than he was. Unable to cope, Oscar put his paws over his ears and made strange snarling noises. "So that's what courts here deal with?" he asked when it made no difference. "Not conviction and punishment, but apology and hugs?" "Indeed," Flumped agreed. "It's nice, isn't it? Then why are there needs for courts at all? If they're all so nice to each other, then why don't they sort their problems out themselves? Why the need for all this formality?" Flumped gestured at all the hugging. "Well, there's the communal post-trial hugs for a start, which are terribly popular." "Popular? Oh yes. It's much nicer to have lots of animals feeling warm and fuzzy, rather than only one or two. Also, it lets the palace know what's going on with their citizens, as well as allowing citizens to know what's going on in their palace." "In the palace? That's right." He indicated the stage again that looked like a well-rehearsed scene from What the Hell Are We Doing, the musical. "Afterwards, these animals will wander around the palace and look at things." "Look at things?" "Yes, and clean up." I'm sorry?" "You know, clean up and make something nice to eat." What animals can just wander around the palace?" "Of course. All animals are encouraged to visit the palace. Nowhere is off limits. The palace is huge, Oscar, and it's great having animals wandering through it aimlessly. They often do the dusting. In fact, many stay overnight after helping with the washing up, and they get breakfast the next morning just as we did. It's all to be shared, you see, provided no gifts are brought." "Gifts? Yes," nodded Flumped. "It's not uncommon for gifts to be brought to the palace. You have seen how nice animals are to each other, so you can imagine the respect they have for the Bovis' family. But because the king is similarly loving, he doesn't dream of accepting anything of the sort, and instead the palace puts visitors up for the night. Sometimes he makes their beds,